The iron bit into his wrists, each step pulling the chains tighter until the metal felt like it was fusing with his skin. The forum swelled around him, marble columns reaching skyward, banners rippling in the August heat, the smell of roasted chestnuts mingling with the tang of sweat and horse dung. Faces leaned in, eyes glinting with cruel amusement. Some spat, others laughed. Coins clinked in the dust as wagers were placed on how long he'd last. If Rome was a theater, pain was the main act, and today, Lucius was the headline performance. A shove between his shoulder blades sent him stumbling forward. His knees hit the stone, scraping open. Blood beaded and ran, warm against his shin. A child no older than 10 pointed and giggled. Somewhere in the throng, a flute trilled a tune he knew, an Athenian melody. But here it sounded warped, too fast, too shrill. He bit the inside of his cheek to keep from breaking. It had been only 6 months since the morning the world collapsed. Back then, he was a musician in a sunlit square in Athens, his lyre cradled like a lover. A crowd had gathered for the festival. He remembered the warm bread in the air, the deep orange of the setting sun, turning the stones to fire. Then came the betrayal. Hands on his arms, a blow to the skull, the shock of waking on a ship's damp deck. A friend had sold him, not for silver, but for debt. Now he belonged to Rome, and Rome took ownership seriously. The guard hauling him barked a command, jerking the chain. Lucius staggered back to his feet. He didn't look up again. Eye contact here was dangerous. It could be taken as defiance, or worse, invitation. The journey ended in a courtyard so bright with polished marble it made his eyes ache. Fountains hissed and sparkled in the heat. Slaves in fine tunics swept sand from the tiles, while others hauled amphorae heavy with wine. Beyond them stood a man in a crimson-bordered toga, leaning on a cane he clearly didn't need. Gaius Cassianus, senator, landowner, patron of the arts, or so the rumors said. His smile was a masterpiece, warm enough to draw you in, sharp enough to cut you when you got close. He studied Lucius the way a gambler studies dice before the throw. So this is the one? His voice was soft, but it carried. The guard nodded. Gaius's gaze slid from Lucius's face to his bound wrists, then back again. Stand straight. A bowed head is for the condemned, not for me. Lucius obeyed. Good, Gaius murmured. You'll do. 2 words, and the weight of his future was sealed. He was led through a shaded colonnade, past frescoes of gods feasting on nectar and wine, past the scent of figs and cinnamon. The beauty was almost cruel, like wrapping poison in honey. The room they stopped in was smaller, quieter. Light from a high window painted gold across the mosaic floor. A table of silver cups waited, alongside cushions strewn in careless luxury. Gaius approached, his sandal soles whispering on stone. Tonight, you will perform for my guests. He didn't elaborate, and Lucius didn't ask. The word perform had a dozen meanings here, none of them gentle. You will smile when spoken to. You will listen more than you speak. And if anyone displeases you, you will remember, your displeasure is not required. Lucius felt the cold settle in his stomach, heavy as lead. The senator circled him once, as if inspecting a horse. Bath first, he said to the nearest servant. Oil his hair. Feed him enough to keep him upright. Hands guided him away, through steam-filled rooms where slaves worked in silence, rubbing scented oil into his skin, combing the tangles from his hair until his scalp burned. They dressed him in a tunic finer than any he had worn in Athens, though it felt like a costume stolen from another man's life. By the time he was led back to the courtyard, dusk had begun to fall. Torches flared along the walls, throwing long shadows across the marble. From somewhere beyond the main hall came the hum of voices, the low chords of a lyre, the clink of cups meeting in toast. Lucius stood just inside the doorway, invisible for now, watching the flicker of torchlight against gilded walls. The air smelled of wine and roasted lamb, yet beneath it all was something else, an undercurrent of danger, like the stillness before a storm. The guard behind him shifted, muttering, "Don't wander," as if there were anywhere to go. A laugh rose above the rest, sharp and familiar. Gaius's. Lucius's pulse quickened, though he couldn't say if it was fear or fury. The torches seemed brighter now, the shadows deeper. Somewhere ahead, the senator's voice called for him. The guard's hand pressed between his shoulder blades, pushing him forward. Lucius stepped into the glow, and the night began. The chamber was warm, the air thick with incense that clung to the back of his throat. Oil lamps burned low, their flames bending in the faint draft from the balcony. Cushions lay scattered across the floor, their silks spilling like molten colors. Beside them, goblets of silver and gold caught the light and tossed it into the shadows. But for all the luxury, the room had an unshakable stillness. The kind that suggested the beauty was only the skin over something rotten. Gaius sat cross-legged among his guests, all men draped in fine wool, their fingers heavy with rings. They spoke in low tones, laughter bubbling now and then like a concealed blade flashing in the dark. None of them looked directly at Lucius, yet he felt their eyes on him, tracing the lines of his face, weighing him. The senator gestured lazily, and a servant guided Lucius forward until he stood at the center of the room. "Our newest addition," Gaius announced, his voice dripping with indulgence. "A gift from Athens, though I suspect Rome will make better use of him." The men chuckled, the sound low and knowing. Lucius lowered his gaze to the mosaic beneath his feet, a swirl of dolphins and waves, as if the floor itself might swallow him. The music started then, a lyre strummed somewhere out of sight. It was not the music of Athens. This tune carried an edge, each note like a step down into a place he didn't want to go. A man with a hawk-like nose beckoned him closer, his breath wine-sweet and heavy. "Do you sing, boy?" he asked. Lucius nodded once. He began softly, letting the words roll in their Greek form. The melody rose, the sound filling the space between the clink of cups and the low rumble of conversation. For a moment, he could almost forget where he was. But when he finished, the applause was muted, replaced by whispers. Someone laughed too loud. A hand gripped his chin, tilting his face toward the lamplight. "Yes," another voice said. "He'll do nicely." The hours blurred. Wine spilled onto the cushions. Laughter grew louder, and yet Lucius felt every moment stretched tight. This wasn't a gathering for art's sake. It was a stage for bargains. He noticed how Gaius leaned in when a guest spoke, how the senator's eyes glinted when another laughed too freely. These men weren't here only for entertainment. They were here to exchange promises, seal alliances, and secure debts. And he, dressed in silk and oiled like a prized sculpture, was part of the currency. At one point, a shadow moved near the far wall, a servant slipping between pillars, with practiced silence. Their eyes met for an instant. The man was older, with the build of someone who'd once been stronger, broader. A faint scar cut across his cheek, pulling his smile into something crooked. Later, when the guests were distracted, he passed by carrying a jug and murmured without looking at Lucius, "Name's Marcus. Watch the one with the rings on his smallest finger. He bites." It was absurd advice, yet the way he said it, dry, almost amused, was the first kindness Lucius had heard all night. The evening stretched on. Gaius made toasts. The guests grew louder, and the smoke in the room thickened until it seemed the walls themselves might dissolve. Lucius learned to move as Marcus had hinted, just enough to please, never enough to invite. Still, he could feel Gaius's gaze on him, measuring, assessing, as if deciding how best to spend this new acquisition. When the guests finally began to leave, the air cooled slightly. Gaius spoke quietly to a man in a military cloak, their heads bent close. Lucius caught only fragments, something about a campaign in the east, something about a gift. The general's eyes, when they flicked toward him, were cold and sharp. Marcus reappeared at his side, filling a cup though no one had asked for it. "You hear that?" he muttered. Lucius hesitated, then nodded. "That one," Marcus continued, "likes to break what he's given, and he doesn't give it back." The thought coiled in Lucius's chest, tight and hot. He didn't speak. He didn't trust his voice. When the last guest departed, the silence was deafening. Gaius stood in the center of the room, back to him, as if studying the flicker of the final lamp. "You did well tonight," the senator said at last. "Tomorrow, you'll do better." He dismissed Lucius with a flick of his fingers. Marcus led him through a side corridor, their footsteps echoing off the stone. "First night's the worst," Marcus said, glancing over his shoulder. "After that, you just get used to it. Or you don't, and it kills you faster. Either way, you stop worrying." Lucius almost smiled, though there was no humor in it. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked. Marcus stopped walking. In the lamplight, his scar cast a shadow across his face. "Every damn day," he said. "That's how I know I'm still alive." Before Lucius could answer, footsteps sounded ahead, brisk, deliberate. A younger slave appeared, breathless. "The master says the general will come tomorrow. He's to be prepared." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Understood," he said, his voice flat. The younger slave hurried off. Lucius stared at Marcus, searching for something. Reassurance, perhaps, or a lie to hold on to. But Marcus only gave him a look that was part warning, part farewell. The corridor seemed colder then, though the air hadn't changed. Somewhere outside, a night bird called, its sound thin and lonely against the dark. Lucius followed Marcus into the dim quarters, the senator's words still clinging to him like smoke. "Tomorrow." "Prepared." The phrases turned over in his mind until they felt heavier than the chains had. He lay down on the thin pallet, staring at the rafters. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was filled with the sound of coins clinking, a liar's uneasy song, and the glint of a general's eyes waiting in the dark. The morning came without warmth. Pale light bled into the quarters, revealing dust motes drifting in the air like ash. Lucius sat upright on his pallet long before the summons came, hands clenched around his knees. He could feel it in the air, a tightening, as if the walls themselves were bracing for something. When the guard arrived, Marcus was already awake, leaning against the far wall. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes flicked toward Lucius with a warning in them. No words. None were needed. They bathed him again, this time with more care. The water was scented with crushed herbs. The oil worked deeper into his skin. A servant combed his hair until it shone. Another tightened the sash of his tunic until it bit at his ribs. It was not preparation, it was packaging. By midday, the household moved with deliberate rhythm. Slaves swept the courtyard, polished goblets, and set out dishes heavy with figs and salted fish. The clatter of preparation was undercut by a hum of unease. Marcus drifted in and out of Lucius's view, carrying trays, murmuring instructions to others, always watching. When the general arrived, the air changed. His steps were firm, each one echoing against the marble. He was broad-shouldered, his cloak a deep crimson, edged with dust from the road. The lines in his face looked carved rather than aged, his gaze sharp enough to cut. Gaius greeted him with open arms, their voices smooth and cordial, yet heavy with calculation. Lucius was summoned to stand before them. Gaius's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, a gesture that might have seemed protective if not for the way his fingers dug in just enough to hold him still. "General Elias," the senator said, "this is the one I spoke of, Athens-born, talented, composed." The general's eyes traveled over him slowly, pausing in ways that made Lucius want to step back. Instead, he stayed rooted, his pulse loud in his ears. "He'll do," Elias said simply. No smile, no flourish, just a verdict. The rest of the afternoon blurred. The general dined in the villa, his voice carrying across the table, speaking of campaigns and conquered cities. Gaius responded with laughter and flattery. Lucius remained in the background, serving wine when summoned, his ears catching fragments, mentions of siege, supply routes, and a need for discretion in certain matters. It was not the language of friendship. It was bargaining. When the guests moved to the peristyle for more wine, Marcus slipped beside him, carrying a tray piled with olives. "He's worse than I thought," Marcus muttered, keeping his voice low. "If he takes you, don't think of coming back. He won't let you." Lucius glanced at him, searching for more. But Marcus had already moved on, his limp barely noticeable as he wove between the guests. By evening, the decision was made. Gaius called for more wine, toasting to mutual benefit. Lucius was told to stand near the general's chair, silent and still, while the men discussed terms in tones meant not to be overheard. He didn't need to hear the words. The shape of the exchange was clear. He was the coin sealing the deal. As night settled over the villa, the tension in Lucius's chest hardened into something else. Fear was still there, heavy and insistent, but beneath it was a smaller, sharper edge anger. He thought of Athens, of the lyre under his fingers, of the square where his songs had once drawn smiles instead of stares. He thought of the friend who had sold him, of the first night in Rome, of the way Gaius's hand had pressed into his shoulder as if to remind him of the ownership carved into his fate. Later, Marcus found him alone in a storage room, counting folded linens. "You're quiet," Marcus said. Lucius looked up. "I'm thinking." "That's dangerous," Marcus replied with a faint smirk. Then softer. "But sometimes it's the only thing keeping you alive." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint trickle of water from a nearby fountain. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "I fought in the arena once. Thought that was the worst of it. Then I traded the sword for this life. Turns out they're the same game, only the weapons are different." Lucius studied him. "Did you ever win?" Marcus shook his head. "Not yet." Something settled in Lucius then. Not hope exactly, but a decision. He would not go to the general's villa and vanish into whatever hell awaited there without trying. He would rather break himself in the attempt than be broken slowly in someone else's hands. The rest of the night passed in fragments. Servants moved through the halls, with trays of wine and platters of roasted meat. Gaius and the general laughed in low tones, sealing their agreement. Lucius kept his eyes down, his thoughts moving faster than the words around him. When the final cup was emptied and the last guest departed, he returned to the slave quarters. Marcus was there, sitting on the edge of his pallet, his scar catching the lamplight. "If you're going to do something," Marcus said without preamble, "you'll need more than courage. You'll need timing. And luck." Lucius lay down, staring into the shadows above him. "Then I'll take both." Marcus gave a short laugh, the sound without mirth. "Luck's rare in Rome. Timing, though, that's just knowing when everyone else is looking the other way." The lamps guttered out one by one, leaving only the dark. Somewhere in the villa, Gaius's voice carried in faint echoes, speaking to a servant about preparations for tomorrow's departure. Lucius closed his eyes, the weight of the day pressing into him. But beneath it, something restless stirred. Tomorrow would not come the way they expected. The night smelled of oil and wet stone. A thin mist had rolled in from the river, muffling the usual clatter of the streets. Somewhere in the villa, the servants were still awake, scrubbing the last of the feast from silver plates. But here in the narrow passage behind the kitchens, it was quiet enough to hear his own pulse. Lucius kept to the shadows, the stolen dagger hidden beneath his tunic. Its weight was small, but its promise was heavy. The plan was simple, though every part of it could kill him. Marcus would create a distraction at the front gates when the general's escort arrived. Lucius would use the chaos to slip away before he could be loaded into the carriage. If luck stayed close, he would be beyond the city's walls before the sun rose. He moved quickly, memorizing each turn of the corridor, each place where the torches threw a blind corner. When he reached the atrium, the air was thick with the scent of burned-out lamps. The general was already there, his cloak thrown over a chair, his boots resting by the fountain. He spoke quietly with Gaius, both men unaware of the figure lingering in the shadows. Then Marcus appeared. He didn't look at Lucius, didn't even slow as he crossed the courtyard. He strode straight to the guards at the gate, his voice carrying just enough to sound urgent. A moment later, the clang of dropped weapons rang out, followed by shouts. Lucius moved. He crossed the edge of the courtyard, keeping low, slipping through the archway into the outer hall. A guard turned, eyes narrowing, but Lucius was already past him, his shoulder striking the man hard enough to stagger him. The corridor to the stable smelled of hay and horse sweat. He could hear the animals shifting in their stalls, their hooves scuffing the stone floor. One of them snorted as he passed, but he didn't slow. The gate was just ahead, freedom close enough to taste. "Lucius." The voice cut through the fog of adrenaline. "Marcus." He turned to see his ally struggling against two guards, their hands locked around his arms, Marcus's eyes found his, sharp and steady. "Go," he rasped. The hesitation lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough for one of the guards to spot him. A shout went up, echoing down the hall. Boots pounded against stone. Lucius ran. The dagger pressed hard against his ribs as he pushed himself forward, breath tearing in his chest. The outer gate loomed ahead, half open, the mist curling through it like an invitation. Behind him, the guard's shouts grew louder, closer. He slipped into the night. The cool air hit his face like water, the sounds of pursuit muffled by the fog. He ran until the villa's torches were no more than pinpricks behind him. The alleys twisted and turned, narrowing to gaps between walls, opening suddenly into small courtyards where cats darted from shadows. Each turn could have led him back into danger, but somehow the darkness guided him forward. By the time he reached the edge of the city, his legs burned and his lungs ached. Ahead, the road stretched into the open countryside, pale under the fading moon. He slowed, listening. Only the whisper of wind through the olive trees answered him. He looked back once. The mist still clung to the city, hiding its towers and walls. Somewhere within it, Marcus was in chains, or worse. The thought tightened at his chest. Freedom had never felt so much like a wound. Lucius kept walking. The sky was beginning to pale, the first threads of dawn tugging at the dark. With each step, the road unrolled before him, empty and uncertain. He didn't know where it would lead, or if it would lead anywhere at all. But it was his to walk. Rome's stones, he thought, would remember the footsteps of slaves long gone. Some had run, some had fallen, some had fought until the end. He didn't know yet which one he would be. The horizon brightened, turning the mist to silver. He adjusted the dagger at his side, its weight now a reminder rather than a burden, and kept moving toward the light. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.